Well, good afternoon to our F11 members and welcome to the latest in my post-production tutorials where I'm looking at the fundamentals of my workflow. What I'd like to do is to tie in with another article that's in this month's issue of the e-zine on light, where I'm talking about white balance and the nature of daylight. So I'd like to go back and just look at a couple of pictures and talk about white balance settings, both in camera and what we can do to them in post-production. So I'm starting with this picture here, shot in a market in Burma. This lovely lady here selling her tomatoes, and I've wandered around the market shooting on my 1DX, and this is the raw image straight out of the camera, no post-production done to it. Now the thing is, in situations like this, in markets, there's all sorts of different light sources. As you can see on this picture, we've got some daylight coming in the back of her stall here. There's probably a bit of mixed lighting from tungsten and fluorescent on her face as well. The color temperature of the picture is all over the place. Now I could of course opt to set auto white balance in camera and let the camera try and sort out the color balance, or I can do it here at the post-production stage. In truth, I often do both. I'll set auto white balance and then fine-tune it here in post-production. But with a picture like this, it's very difficult to know what kind of white balance to go for, because there are mixed lighting sources in the picture. Now I've imported the picture and it says white balance as shot, and the 1DX, for some confusing reason, when I have it set to daylight, gives me a daylight setting of 5050 Kelvin. It seems that all cameras come in with a slightly different figure around here, ranging from about 5000 to 5500 Kelvin. It's not something to really lose sleep over, but of course I could, if I wanted, set this figure in the camera to be 5200 and then import it as shot, and that would sort that out. Nevertheless, looking at this picture, what are my options? Well, I can just start moving the slider around to adjust the color balance by eye to suit, and I think, generally speaking, looking at this picture, if I double click on that cursor, it brings it back to where I started. It is a touch too warm. Ultimately, all color balance adjustments are subjective, but in this particular case, I'm going to move it down, cool it down a bit. Well, that's one approach, but I think I can be a little bit more controlled than that. And actually, this is a really good use of this white balance selector here. Now if I click here and pick a white tone, it will automatically adjust the color balance to suit. The trouble is, if I look at this picture, there are no real white tones. I could do it on this notice board in the background there, which seems pretty white, and that's given me, let's just do that again. That's given me a setting not very different at all from my starting point. That's because the back wall there is pretty much lit by daylight. But of course, our lady here in the foreground, she is lit by all sorts of different lighting situations, and in theory what I would have got her to do would be hold a white card which I could then sample. But let's face it, in a crowded marketplace in Burma, you're not exactly likely to work that way. So I'm going to take this color picker and move it onto this bit of this white bag just behind her and use that as my reference point. And there, it's brought it in. It's given a much more neutral feel, a much more believable tone, flesh tone in my eyes. So that's how I've color balanced that particular picture. This white balance selector is very useful in certain situations. As you know, with landscapes I very alter the color balance, but in situations like that it's pretty useful to be able to do that. Well, let's look at another example, actually, a different picture, a landscape shot. So I'm going to actually come down here and select a picture which I shot just recently in Patagonia of a glacier. Let's just come right down here and get the right selection. And I'm liking this shot here, which has got a piece of ice in the foreground and the glacier behind. It's shot late morning, so the nature of the light is very much daylight. And if I go to my camera settings here, you can see again I've shot this on the 5D Mark III, and for some reason there's a 150 degree Kelvin discrepancy between what the 1DX and the 5D Mark III call daylight. Still, not to worry. If I'm looking at that shot there, and it's a touch bright at the moment, but that's okay. I've exposed well. You can see from this histogram up here, it's a perfect exposure. There's no clipping of highlights or shadows, and that's important in a high contrast scene like this, because I really wouldn't want to start burning off these tones here. So I'm just going to give you an idea of how the overall picture is going to look when I've finished processing. If you expose properly, you're able to adjust the density to suit subsequently afterwards in post-production, and just by pulling the tone curve there, I give the image far more depth. But it's the white balance that is particularly interesting in this particular picture, because if you look at this shot, you can see just how blue that glacier looks, can't you? Why is that? Well, it's a funny thing that ice, in particular glaciers, do look blue for two reasons. First of all, in the shadows here, if I zoom in close, these kind of shadows here, they're picking up the light from the blue sky up here. That's what's reflecting from the shadows there, blue light. So that's one factor, and the other factor is that actually glaciers look blue because old ice, which has been compressed, basically absorbs the red end of the spectrum whilst reflecting the blue end. Now the thing is, if it's an interesting thing to do here is, if I now simulate auto white balance, I'm going to activate auto white balance in Lightroom. You could do it in camera and the effect would be exactly the same. Just look at this. Now look at what auto white balance is trying to do. It's looking at that blue cast of the glacier and trying to correct it. And the end result is actually pretty horrible, I think you'll admit. It's given the whole shot this muddy brownish feel. The sparkling nature of the glacier has been lost completely. That's because it's trying to neutralize that blue cast from the glacier. And look at the adjustment it's put in here. We've gone way up to 7500, almost plus 2000 on the Kelvin scale, plus a load of tint as well. I'm going to go back to as shot, and this picture in a nutshell represents to me why for my landscape work I virtually always shoot with daylight white balance set in camera, and then very, very rarely altering it subsequently. If that's how the picture looks, I don't want it to be corrected. Now clearly, if I was a wedding photographer, this isn't a location I'd be likely to be shooting, but let's just say I was, and I had a bride on the glacier there, then clearly brides expect to have their wedding dresses looking white, and I probably would use the same technique which I did with Our Lady selling her tomatoes in Burma, to use the white balance selector on her dress to make sure everything was neutral and white. But for a landscape shot, it's not really an issue, and I generally go with what nature gives me. Just out of interest, if I use the white balance selector and put it on this piece of ice up there, there's a little bit of correction. as you can see, 400 Kelvin. Not much, nothing compared to dialing in auto white balance as I did there. So I'm going to go back to as shot, and that's how I'm going to keep my shot. Just out of interest here, what I would do now, because I've got quite a few, I've kept my highlights here. I want to put in a touch of maybe a bit more contrast. I want to give the shot a bit of impact. It's looking a little lacking in sparkle, but just this tweaking of the tone curve is really all I need to do to that picture. That is it. No vibrance, no clarity, nothing. It's all there. So that concludes this particular tutorial. From this issue, we're bringing you 2 video tutorials this month on post-production and other related matters. So stay tuned, F11 members. We're going to carry on working through the workflow in bite-sized manageable chunks. Thank you.